Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are teaching this upcoming Sunday morning. If you're teaching on October the 18th, 2015 at Dayspring and you're leading a group of adults, then this video is designed to help you get ready for this week's lesson. So you should have in front of you a copy of your lesson. I'm going to be looking at it with you and pointing some things out, and maybe those things will be helpful to you as you get ready to teach. So go ahead and grab that. We're going to look at it together. You'll see it's dated October 18th, 2015. You're going to be teaching out of John chapter 21. I think it's going to be a great lesson for you. All right. Now, this particular lesson is a great complement to what I'm going to be teaching in the main room. And obviously, every Sunday, our lessons are designed to complement. But this one's going to be especially a good complement because this lesson, I'm going to be teaching on Samson. You're going to be teaching something from the life of Simon Peter. And in many ways, the lesson that you're going to teach is going to answer the questions that are going to rise from what I'm going to teach. Because as I teach on Samson, we're going to see some of the great shortcomings he had, and which created some really big moments of failure in his life. This lesson you're teaching really answers the question, how do I overcome spiritual failures? How do I overcome those sorts of things, and how do I respond? This is a message of hope that you're delivering, and a lesson of hope. Because what you're really addressing is, what hope is there really for people who make a mess of their lives? The sermon I'm going to teach will answer that, obviously to some degree, but some may really walk out with the question of, what do I do now? Okay, so your lesson's going to answer that in many respects, and you see on page 1 of your lesson just sort of an introduction to the lesson itself, but where you'll start teaching is on page 2. So let's start looking at that together. On page 2, you have an opening illustration, and it has to do with the TV show The Biggest Loser. You're no doubt familiar with that show. I think it still airs. I'm not sure. I never really watched it regularly, but The Biggest Loser, as you know, is a show where a lot of folks who really need some help with their weight, they come on the show, and through a series of sort of competitions, those who can continue to lose the most weight keep going on. And by the end of the show, it's pretty remarkable. Somebody who came in initially weighing maybe in excess of 400 pounds, by the end is, 150 pounds or 180 pounds, whatever it may be, and has had this total transformation of their life. Well, that illustration serves the purpose to transition you into your lesson content, because really what you're talking about is when we fail God. There are all sorts of disappointments that we bring onto ourselves. Some of them are physical, some are financial or maybe relational, but the most devastating of failures oftentimes are our spiritual failures, because we realize that we have let God down or we failed God, and those sorts of failures make us feel like a big loser is what it does. And that opening illustration kind of segues you into that moment, because that's how we feel when we fail God. I'm just a big loser. And where do I go from here? And if you look down on the bottom of page 2, as you're making this opening illustration and transition into your content, look at the very bottom of page 2 on that last bigger paragraph where it says, in our small groups, we're going to further explore this truth. Look at that next statement. It says, we're going to see from the example of one man's life that the only person who can get our lives back on track is not a personal trainer, it's Jesus. He can restore our lives and get us on the track we need to be on, the track that we never could have found ourselves. So really, that's what this lesson is about. When I, as a follower of Jesus, have just gone off the rails, when I've totally gone off the tracks, what hope is there for me? What do I do from there? And this lesson is going to show us that Jesus has the capacity to totally restore us and get us back on track. So it's a message of hope, okay? So you've got 3 points that you're going to make as you teach, as it talks about getting back on track with Jesus and overcoming the failure of disappointing Him. So let's look at those together. Move over to page 3. As you move into this passage of restoration, it is John 21. This is the passage you're teaching. This is when Jesus restores Simon Peter. The context of this is after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, okay? And Simon Peter feels like a big loser. We'll get into that in a moment. But Jesus fully restores him and commissions him to be this great leader of this thing called the church, okay? And there are three things that are pointed out in this lesson that we need to do if we are going to overcome our spiritual failures. Three things that we need to do. And here's the first one. Look on page 3. It says we need to remember that Jesus forgives even the biggest of losers. Okay, and obviously that's playing off of the terminology of your opening illustration. If you don't like the term big loser, then you can change that to the biggest of sinners or the biggest of failures, whatever it may be. But the point is this, is that Jesus forgives even the deepest of sinners and the deepest of failures. And here's why that's hopeful, because anybody in your group, they're going to fall somewhere on that chain of the greatest failure spiritually, or the most slight failure, whatever they consider themselves to be. If Jesus forgives even the greatest of spiritual failures, which actually we're all on equal plane there, but to the person who considers themselves a really significant spiritual failure, if Jesus forgives even the deepest spiritual failure, then there's no one within the sound of your voice who can't be forgiven and restored by God, okay? So you have to remember that Jesus forgives even the biggest of losers. That's when you're going to read your passage from John chapter 21. This is the passage where Jesus restores Simon Peter by asking him, do you love me? Do you love me? And Jesus asked that question 3 times. Now, what this lesson's going to do at this point is it's going to remind your group of the fuller context. And the fuller context has to do with what Simon Peter did as Jesus was about to be arrested, or as Jesus had been arrested and was about to be crucified. You remember that story, right? Simon Peter's out in the courtyard. Jesus is being interrogated, mistreated, beaten. And 3 times Simon Peter is asked if he knows Jesus. And 3 times he denies him. And after Simon Peter denies Jesus, the rooster crows, which triggers for him this reminder of what Jesus told him he would do in denying him 3 times. And it says that Simon Peter went out and he wept bitterly. I mean, this was the worst moment of his life. A bitter weeping is that kind where you pretty much feel like there's no hope for you. You've gone over the line. And that's where Simon Peter found himself. I've denied Jesus 3 times in his greatest hour of need, and he wept bitterly. Now, your lesson's going to remind your group of that as it moves over onto the following page on page 4. It's going to remind everybody that Simon Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And what you're going to point out here in this lesson is that now as Jesus is resurrected and is going to bring Simon Peter back into the fold, it's 3 times that Jesus asked Simon Peter, do you love me? He gave Simon Peter the opportunity 3 times to sort of undo what he did, if you will. I mean, one time he said, I don't even know Jesus. Well, he's getting to cover that up with a confession of love. Yeah, but he did it a second time. Well, Jesus gives him a chance to confess his love a second time. Yeah, but he denied Jesus a 3rd time. So a 3rd time, Jesus gives Simon Peter the chance to confess his love for him. You're pointing that out, and that's significant because this is what this is a picture of, and this is what you're pointing out at this point in the lesson. What Jesus does here on the beach with Simon Peter and asking him 3 times, do you love me? This is a picture of total restoration. Total restoration. Jesus is saying, Simon Peter, there's not a single failure in your past that I'm not going to cover up with my love and with what I've done on the cross. And Simon Peter, there are no outstanding debts that need to be paid. Even the deepest of sinners and the deepest of sin is covered by what Jesus did through his death, burial, and resurrection. And I'll tell you, there's some great passages in the Bible that you can really use here to make that point if your group gets into sort of a discussion moment here. 1 John chapter 1, verse 9 is a great verse in the Bible, that if we confess our sin, God is faithful and just and will forgive us of our sin and cleanse us of all unrighteousness. It's not a partial deal. When Jesus restores us into relationship with God, it's not kind of because we do this in our human relationships. We'll say, well, I'll take you back in, but you're on a, no strike policy from now on. Jesus doesn't do that. He completely and perfectly and fully forgives. And I'll tell you another great passage, because we're talking about restoration here, being restored into good union and harmony and relationship with God, as a believer in particular, where you've really blown it and your closeness with God's been messed up and you just don't feel like you can even look him in the eye anymore, God totally forgives. I'll tell you, a great Old Testament passage that I love is found in the book of Joel. Joel is a prophet prophesying to Israel, and he's talking about the judgment and hardship that comes upon Israel, and it's a bunch of locusts that come in and swarm their crops and completely just annihilate their livelihood. But there's a passage, there's a verse in chapter 2 of Joel, I believe it's verse 25, it's right in that area, where God says to Israel, I'm going to restore what the locusts have eaten. I mean, I'm gonna make it full again. I'm going to fill up your fields again. I'm going to make everything as if there was no offense in the first place. And this is what your group needs to hear. Because when we fail Jesus and we feel like I'm the biggest of losers spiritually, we need to know that even that person who feels that way, who honestly feels that's the truth about themselves, that God fully restores them. And he illustrates that in the life of Simon Peter. When Simon Peter feels like I've sinned against Jesus so bad that this will never be forgiven, Jesus makes it crystal clear to him by asking him 3 times, do you love me? Jesus is showing a picture of full restoration, not partial, full restoration and full forgiveness. It's a beautiful picture, isn't it? So, what do? How do we recover from spiritual failures? Well, first of all, we have to realize that Jesus forgives even the deepest of sin and the deepest of sinners. All right, that's the first thing. Number 2 is found on page 4, where it says that we must recognize that Jesus demands that we follow his leading in our lives. Now look at that statement again. We have to recognize that Jesus demands we follow his leading in our lives. You know, Jesus does place demands on his followers. Following him in and of itself is a demand. And here's the thing. As it comes back to this text with Simon Peter, because what you're going to do is you're now going to read again where Jesus asked him 3 times, do you love me? And 3 times Simon Peter said yes. What you're going to point out now is this interesting thing that Jesus does is he puts a demand on the end of each of Simon Peter's answers. Do you love me? Yes, I love you. Jesus says, okay, well, good. Then feed my sheep. Do you love me? Yes, I love you. Okay, good. Tend my lambs. Do you love me? You know that I love you, Jesus. Okay, then feed my sheep. 3 times, Jesus gives a demand to Simon Peter, and really where your lesson's going to go from here is simply this. And by the way, when Jesus says, feed my sheep, tend my lambs, all of that, he's really pointing to what Simon Peter is about to do. He's going to shepherd the flock of Jesus. After Jesus ascends, gives birth to this thing called the church, Simon Peter's going to lead it. And Jesus is now saying, this is what you're going to have to do from this point forward, okay? As one who's been restored to me, as one who's been forgiven, there's now a big demand that I'm placing upon you. Go and lead my people, feed my sheep. Now, here's really what you're getting at on this part of the lesson, is that restoration with God and forgiveness from God and being restored to God, it doesn't result in business as usual. Those who have been forgiven by God and those who have been restored unto God, there is a change in their life that should be expected, okay? Now, page 5 is going to clarify some things here as you get down into this. You're going to make sure that what people are not hearing from you is this kind of idea that in order to be forgiven by God, we've got to live good now. And in order to be received by God, we've got to walk a straight line and not fall off of it. You know, that's a works-related type of a thing, and we know that that's not true. God's love for us isn't conditional on how well we serve him or how well we love him back. God loves us because that's who he is. He is love. When we receive his love, however, it does something to us. It does change the way that we walk because we're new creations, we're forgiven people. It does something to us. Now, there are some who and what you're doing here is you're making sure people don't get the cart before the horse and hear you saying, okay, well, to be forgiven and restored, then I've got to, feed Jesus' sheep. No, that's the cart before the horse. But here's the deal. There is a cart behind the horse. And when Jesus forgives me, I recognize that's going to come with some demands. Now, you may have some people who who object to this sort of an idea and recoil. I know some people who don't like to talk about the lordship of Jesus at all, but it's a real thing. And in fact, First John, we talked about First John chapter 1, verse 9, that if we confess our sin, he's faithful and just to forgive us. You go back and read the preceding verses to First John chapter 1, verse 9. I mean, it says things like, if we claim to be in Christ, but we're walking in dark ways, we're deceiving ourselves. We're not in the light at all. It says if we continue in this habitual pattern of sin throughout our lives, we really should have no reason to think that we've ever been forgiven of our sin. So my point is this. We need to realize that when God forgives us and restores us, that's going to come with this relinquishing of the rights to our life. And what we're going to have to now realize is that he's going to lead us somewhere. As a forgiven person, as a restored person, God has a path that he's going to lead us on, and he's going to expect that we walk it. As you make that point, you're going to bring everybody back to verse 18 and 19 to show that Jesus says, he tells Simon Peter, after Simon Peter says, yes, I love you, and Jesus says, feed my sheep 3 times, Jesus then goes on to tell Simon Peter how he's going to die. He points out how he's going to die, and Jesus said there's going to come a day where people are going to take you and lead you out. Just like they led me out of the city, Jesus says, and crucified me. There's going to come a time where people lead you out, Simon Peter. And really what you're getting at here is Simon Peter, in being this one who's now restored to Jesus and going to take the reins and lead the church, Jesus is telling him, you're not going to guide your own steps from here out. You need to know that. There's a path that I've chosen for you, and you're going to end up walking it. And you're going to lead everybody to verses 18 and 19 that points that out. And I want to show you on your teaching transcript here, if you've got it open to page 5, those last 2 full paragraphs. Look at what it says there. It says, church tradition states that Peter died much the same way that Jesus did, at the hands of Roman soldiers who crucified him. Tradition states that Peter considered himself undeserving to die in the same exact manner as the Lord, so he requested that he be crucified upside down on a cross. That's gruesome. In our passage in John, Jesus tells Peter that he's no longer going to be in charge of his own life. That's what he's saying when he says that another will lead him. And that person will lead him to an eventual gruesome death. But despite this fact, feed my sheep is what he's telling me. And the whole point again is this, that when we are restored from our status of perpetual spiritual failure, when Jesus erases that, and he can, and he does, when he erases that, we have to live with this awareness that we're now going to live a life that's led by him. It's not going to be our own life. We're not going to be calling our own shots. We need to be prepared for that. So, first 2 points. We need to realize that Jesus forgives even the biggest of losers. We need to recognize that Jesus demands that we follow his lead. That brings you to the third teaching point that you're going to make. It's found on page 6 of your teaching transcript here. Look at it. It says, we must accept that Jesus' plan for me may look very different from his plan for others. And we're talking about, what does restoration look like in my life? I have to realize it may look very different than the life of another who's been restored. And what you're going to point out here is the rest of the passage in this John 21 one. Because after Jesus says these things, do you love me? Yes. Do you love me? Yes. Do you love me? Yes. Feed my sheep. And then Jesus says, Simon Peter, one day people are going to take you and your arms are going to be stretched out. They're going to lead you to that end. Simon Peter responds he sees John over out of the corner of his eye, I guess, and he says, well, what about him? And I love Jesus' answer. He says, what's it to you? What's it to you what happens to him? I'm talking about you. And what it's going to look like now is this person who's been restored to me and forgiven completely and fully. I'm talking about how that's going to look for you, Simon Peter. And what we have to realize is this, that even restoration, those who've been restored to God fully and forgiven fully, the rest of my life may look different from someone else who's been restored by God fully and forgiven fully. So we can't make the assumption that just because I had a friend who went off the rails, but God restored him, and then after God restored him, God did this thing with his life. I can't assume that it's going to work out for me that way. So I also can't assume that when my life doesn't work out like that, that God hasn't forgiven me fully. That's really what you're getting at here on this part, okay? Because John's going to go on to live a full life, really, in terms of number of years. Simon Peter won't. And does that mean that Simon Peter wasn't fully forgiven and fully restored by Jesus? Oh, no. He absolutely was. But God had a different plan for him as to how that would all play out. We have to remember what God is creating in his people is a body, different parts, with different roles, different functions, different assignments. And it doesn't mean we haven't been restored and forgiven, just because we don't receive the quote-unquote privileges that somebody else does. So that's your 3 points that you're making. That lesson finishes up on page 7. From there, you break your groups into their smaller clusters where they work through their handouts. You'll see that on your in your materials you've got. And then from there, after you've given your group time to work on those, you conclude your lesson, and you see that conclusion there on page 9, I believe it is. Yeah, page 9. Just a nice, quaint conclusion. Works up to a memory verse, which is always a good way to finish your group time. All right, so this is a message of hope. It's a message for those who would say to themselves, I'm just a big loser. Spiritually, I'm a big loser. I've failed God. Is there any hope for me? What you're answering in this lesson is yes, absolutely there is hope. Simon Peter experienced it. He was the biggest of losers as far as he was concerned. Jesus restored him fully and then let him know, I've got a plan for you. I'm going to use you. You're not going to call your own shots. It may not be the life that you expected, but Simon Peter, walk this road. Walk this road because you're following me again, and I've fully restored you and fully forgiven you. All right? So I hope that resonates with somebody in your group. I hope somebody who needs to hear it hears it. All right? And I hope you're the one who has the privilege to communicate that to them and see their life changed. All right? Hey, God bless you. Thanks for listening in and watching the video. I hope it's been helpful to you. God bless you as you study. We'll see you Sunday.